Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode, another live stream with Montana Outdoor Science School. My name is Melanie. I'm one of the instructors here with Moss. We are doing a live stream today all about skulls and the science behind skulls. So if you do have any questions at all during the course of this small video, please feel free to type in the comments. We do have somebody who's ready to help answer. I can also help answer as I see them, but know that I may not see all your questions that pop up as I go along. So without further ado, let's get started. Skulls are a super interesting study that has a lot of facets to it. All animals that have skulls are vertebrates. And if you recall, vertebrates are every animal that has a backbone. We have backbones. Larry the leopard gecko, who I showed last time, has a backbone. Rosie the corn snake. These creatures all have a spinal cord protected by vertebrae. Let me show you guys what a vertebrae looks like. I'll take this one right out here. So a vertebrae is essentially a segment of bone, and it protects the spinal cord. On this vertebrae here, the spinal cord would have been going through this hole here, and then there would have been many of these bones lined up together to form a backbone. This vertebrae does not belong to the skull I currently have at the moment, but it is a really good example to show you where a spinal cord would have lay inside of a backbone, how a vertebrae looks. You can feel your own vertebrae in your neck or along your back by feeling the back of your neck there, and all those little bumps that you may feel are a part of your vertebrae. So on this guy, it may have been that this is that sort of protrusion, and that is where we feel our backbones. So I'm going to take this back over this way, and I'll bring back our little skull here, because the backbone, of course, leads to the skull eventually. Let me show you guys where that would attach. I have here a very specific type of skull. This is a bobcat skull, but everything I'm talking about today can be applied to skulls in general, not just this one and only skull. On this skull, this little bobcat would have had vertebrae that attached right back here into this hole. The spinal cord would have gone through here, and of course we know that the skull protects the brain. So everywhere in this area here is where the brain cavity would have been, and it essentially is responsible for all aspects of an animal's life. The brain is such an important organ. It helps all sorts of processes. It helps movement. It helps regulating the body. So the brain is really important, which is why skulls end up being as complicated and as, I guess, as large of bones as they are. Which brings us to the next point about bones. The skull, even though it's all held together by just a single kind of piece, it is actually made up of all kinds of bones. The skull has lots and lots of bones to it, and I'm going to show you guys what that looks like. Any vertebrate, when they're born, they don't have the bones locked together in place like a suture. As a vertebrate grows, these lines start to come together, and they start to kind of solidify. But when most vertebrates are born, their bones and their skull are separate, and that helps for any creature to be born. It makes it easier both for the mother and for the infant. We can see some more of those lines, especially along the nasal area here. All these little lines. This bobcat was an adult bobcat, so these lines aren't quite as distinct as they may have been if this were a younger bobcat. Oh, but you can see a pretty good line right... Will it show? Yep, right there. There you go. Those little lines. So when this bobcat was born, those lines were not quite, those sutures were not quite as well put together. They were not fused together the way they are now. Furthermore, there's all kinds of bones in the skull itself. There's ones along the side near the ear. There's ones along the back of the head. And this is kind of an area where a lot of the brain's capacity to analyze visuals comes from. There are bones that are along the sides of the eyes here, and then the face itself has a ton of bones. The arch here, this is kind of like a cheekbone, it has a couple of bones to it as well. And then the nasal cavity, I don't know if you guys can see that, there's all kinds of delicate little tiny bones in there. So there's a ton of bones, but they are all fused together. They are all held together as one piece, one solid bone that we call the skull. The brain, or excuse me, the skull does not just hold the brain, it holds a lot of sensory organs too for animals. So in vertebrates, we have our sense of taste, our sense of sight, smell, hearing, and all these things are focused, all the organs for that are focused in the skull area, which kind of makes it interesting to study skulls because you can decide, or you can figure out what animals' behavior was, what their diet was, based on specializations of those sensory organs. So let's look at this bobcat sensory areas and talk about that a little bit. The reason I chose the bobcat skull as my overall general skull topic was because the eye sockets on the bobcat are really, really great. You can clearly see this is where the eye would have been, and it's really large compared to maybe some other animals, which is why I chose it specifically. You can see very easily where they would have fit, where they would have gone. In some creatures, this area right back here tends to be very large, and it can sometimes be confusing if the eye goes there or if the eye goes here. Sometimes these two bones right here don't, or they are separate even more, or sometimes they're connected all around. On our skulls, we have these two bones connected entirely, which makes it really easy to tell where our eye sockets are. But it's not always clear on animal skulls, especially if you find them out in the wild, and especially if you find them not nearly as pristine as this skull specimen is. So eye sockets go there. I want to point out something too about the eyes and how it connects to the brain. So there is a nerve at the back of our eyes called the optic nerve, and the nerve has to get to the brain somehow. And I wanted to show you guys this. Do you see that little hole right through there? There's a few series of holes. The optic nerve goes through one of those holes to actually get into the brain itself, and that's how the brain is able to then process those visuals that the eye might receive. There's a few other holes amongst the skull too, and they're responsible for other nerves that may be more have to do with the movement of the animal, or even blood veins and blood arteries. So if we look, there's another hole there. On the front side, there's these holes here on either side, and then on the lower jaw there's a couple. Yeah, do you guys see those two holes there? Those are also responsible for nerves and blood vessels being able to reach the inside of bones, or to pass through bone to reach other things on the opposite side. So that's sight. Let's move along now to smell. You might have noticed with this bobcat skull, it looks a little different than what it might have been in life, of course, because the nose is missing. And it's not that it's missing, it's that the nose is made mostly of cartilage, or at least the nose parts that we can see on the outside of a living animal. This is true with our noses too. If you feel your nose, you'll notice it's kind of squishy. That is cartilage in there. It can be moved around a little bit. It doesn't have a rigid feel to it. But with skulls, what we do end up having left behind is the inside of the nasal cavity, which is the area where nasal receptors, cells that are responsible for picking up odors, are going to be at. All these very, very delicate little membrane in here, bone membranes in here, that is where mucous membranes would be developing. This is where those cell receptors would be at. And you can see it's very, very, very delicate in there. A lot of skulls end up missing these parts in them. They're very difficult to clean. They may end up being lost due to damage. So to be able to see that in this bobcat skull is really special. I want you guys to be able to have a view of that here in the bobcat. And if you kind of, I wonder if I can get you guys to see it. Oh, you can see right through the brain. And oh, let me see if it'll focus again. If you can look all the way to the back, or rather from the back of the skull to the front of the skull, you can see some of that very delicate nasal cavity work by the bone. I see somebody's asking a question as to where does the brain go. It's a great question, thank you. We talked earlier about how the spinal cord connects to the skull back here, and this hole at the back of the skull is where the spinal cord would have then connected to the brain. And the brain is held all in this big area underneath the bone. So the only way we can really see where the brain would have been was through that hole. Otherwise, the brain would have been encapsulated by bone all the way around the outside. So I hope that answers your question there. Let's move along now to the sense of taste, which actually there's not a whole lot to be discussed about taste. All the soft tissue that would have been here in this bobcat to kind of show that is gone. But you know what is left is all of the teeth. And the teeth are really important things that scientists use to help identify the type of skull they may have, to decide what sort of lifestyle the animal may have had. So if we look at these teeth, we can kind of go through and talk about each of their jobs. On any skull, you'll have a few kinds of teeth. And maybe some skulls only have 2 of these sets, maybe some skulls only have 1 of these sets. On the bobcat, though, there are 4 main types of teeth that they have. We see these tiny little teeth here. And these ones are called incisors. There's top and there's bottom incisors. The top incisors are, let me see if I can get the camera to focus. Top incisors are, of course, right here, and the bottom incisors are sitting right here. And the incisors in animals are responsible for kind of snipping food away. In a bobcat, which is a carnivore, the incisors aren't going to be very well developed. They're not going to be very big, but nevertheless, they do serve a purpose for that bobcat during its life. So it's really important that the incisors are nice and sharp. The word itself kind of sounds like the word scissors, and that's exactly what incisors are doing. They're cutting into things the way scissors might. We, of course, have a really, really well-known tooth right here. This is a canine tooth, and there are top canine teeth and bottom canine teeth on this bobcat. Something that's really nice about this bobcat specimen, too, is it has all of its teeth. Another reason I wanted to bring this one out specifically. So the canines for this creature end up being very large. On us, we don't have them look nearly as large, but they do still serve a purpose, and they especially help this bobcat here. We can tell that because of how large and how developed they are. We then move on to premolars, which are the first handful of teeth here, and in a lot of animals, the premolars can be in all kinds of numbers. Sometimes it's just 1 or 2, sometimes it's none, sometimes it's something like 8 or so. It can be a ton. So the premolars just end up being the first handful of teeth that work their way to the back of the jaw. And of course, towards the back of the jaw is the molars, the regular molars. Premolars and molars have roughly the same job. They're both responsible for chewing up meat further. And on these ones, we can see they're very, very sharp. Another video, we will talk more about teeth, differences between herbivores and between carnivores. But for now, I just wanted you guys to be able to see the different types of teeth. So remember, we have the incisors in the front, kind of like scissors, the canines, which are those big pointy ones, and then we have premolars and molars. I hope you guys will remember those for the next kind of skull videos that we end up doing. So that's our sense of taste and the skull's relationship to that. Let's move on to the hearing sense organs. And again, kind of like how the nose is missing on this bobcat, we do have an area where we would expect to see maybe ears coming off of this animal, but we don't see anything. And that's again because of cartilage. You can feel your own cartilage in your ears. They are made really soft. They're often lost or they deteriorate faster than bones will, so that's why we don't see them. However, what we do get left from the ear pieces is an ear bulb. So do you see these kind of rounder areas here? In these bulbs is all of the bones and all of the organs responsible for hearing. And in the bobcat skull that I have here, we can see one of the hearing bones. Let me get a tinier thing to point with. if you see this tiny little bone here, that is one of the 3 bones that exists in most vertebrates' ears. This one is still attached in there, and that's something that's really delicate that you might not find in all the skulls that you come across, which is another reason I chose this bobcat skull as the specimen we'd look at today. Inside of that bulb, it's kind of hard to see, but there's all kinds of more delicate structures in there, similar to the nasal cavity, but that tiny, tiny little bone is responsible for making sound go from one section of the ear to the next section and eventually to the brain, where the brain can then process what it's receiving from the ear bone as well. Let's see. So once again, looking at our skull here, we've got not just the area that the brain goes, but we also have all the areas that the sensory organs go. So we have eyes that go here. We have the sense of smell here in the nasal cavities. Taste and teeth are kind of go hand in hand with the skull. And then we also have the hearing area on our ear bulb right back here, just like so. I do see somebody asked a question again, what are bobcats' teeth made out of? So all teeth end up being made out of bone, but also on the outside of it is enamel. So this enamel, it's different than the rest of the bone. You've probably seen it in that it's shinier. If you've ever picked up a skull, it's much shinier, and to some degree it ends up being a lot harder than bones. This enamel is what protects the teeth. It's what helps them stay nice and clean through the life of that animal. And to be fair, I couldn't tell you what enamel's exactly made out of, only that it is a slightly different composition than the bone itself. So I hope that helps with that question there that you asked. Good questions, folks. I really like it. Thank you. Oops. A fun fact, the lower jaw is not considered a part of the skull technically. But if you ever do find a skull with a lower jaw, it really does help with identifying said animal. It helps too with how the animal, you can tell how the animal functioned. You know, I'm almost second guessing myself. Maybe the lower jaw is considered a part of the upper, or part of the whole skull now, but you don't have to have a lower jaw to always be able to identify an animal, but it certainly helps, and it helps being able to tell what that animal did in its life. So, folks, that's about everything I have for you today. We will be continuing to upload these videos to Facebook. There's talk of perhaps doing this too in the future for YouTube, so stay tuned for that. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, please like us on Facebook. Also, feel free to subscribe and follow us on Facebook or Instagram. Otherwise, we will see you again on Friday, 11 a.m. as usual for our next live stream with Montana Outdoor Science School. Thanks, everybody, and hope you have a good rest of your day.